Brandon Lee was filming the scene in which his character died when he died. This is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic construction or a retrospective framing. It is the literal sequence of events on the night of March 31st, 1993, at Carolco Studios in Wilmington, North Carolina. The scene called for Eric Draven, the rock musician murdered and resurrected as a supernatural avenger in the graphic novel adaptation Brandon had been shooting since February, to walk into his apartment and be shot and killed by a group of criminals. Brandon walked. An actor named Michael Massey fired a gun at him from 15 feet away. Brandon fell. The director called cut. Brandon didn't move. He was 28 years old. He was 8 days from his wedding. His fiancée, Eliza Hutton, was in Los Angeles, waiting. His father was Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee had died on July 20, 1973, 20 years earlier, at the age of 32, 6 days before Enter the Dragon opened in Hong Kong. Brandon was 8 years old when his father died. He grew up knowing the number 6, the days that separated his father's death from the moment the world saw what his father had built. He died, leaving his own number behind, 44. The days between his death on April 1st, 1993, he survived for several hours after the shooting, and The Crow's American premiere on May 13th, 1994. Father and son, 6 days, 44 days, both buried at Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, side by side on the same hillside. Brandon Lee was born on February 1st, 1965, in Oakland, California. His father was already famous enough in Hong Kong that Brandon's birth was news, but not yet famous enough in America that it meant anything to the hospital staff at Oakland's Children's Hospital where he was born. He grew up in Los Angeles in the specific circumstances of a child whose famous parent occupied a complicated space, present enough to be a presence, absent enough through work and the structure of a career in progress to leave gaps that an 8-year-old could fall into. When Bruce died, Brandon was too young to process it as a biographical fact. He processed it as a disappearance. The gap his father had left in daily life became a permanent gap, filled with the growing weight of what Bruce Lee meant to the rest of the world, a weight that increased every year as Enter the Dragon circulated and the films consolidated into legend, and the martial arts craze of the 1970s made Bruce Lee's face one of the most recognized on the planet. Linda Lee, Brandon's mother, moved the family back to California after Bruce's death. Brandon and his sister Shannon grew up in Los Angeles in proximity to the entertainment industry that had claimed their father before it could fully receive him. Brandon was a naturally athletic child who had, by the accounts of people who knew him as a teenager, his father's specific quality of physical intelligence, the ability to understand movement and to reproduce it with the specific precision that separates people who are good at physical things from people who are exceptional at them. He also had, more complicatedly, his father's face, the angular features, the dark intensity in the eyes, the specific physical presence that made people look twice. This was an asset and a difficulty simultaneously. It opened doors. It also made it harder for the person behind the face to establish that there was a person behind the face. He trained in martial arts inevitably. Not because he was forced to, but because the connection between his own physical capability and his father's legacy was not something he could easily separate or ignore. He trained in acting with specific seriousness at the Lee Strasberg Theater Institute because what he wanted was not an action star's career, but a serious actor's career. And he understood that those were not the same thing, and that achieving the latter when you were the son of Bruce Lee would require deliberate navigation. Chuck Norris, who had been his father's friend and student, spent time with Brandon after Bruce's death, telling him stories about his father, giving him context that an 8-year-old could not have held at the time of his father's death. Brandon grew up knowing what Bruce Lee meant to the world. He spent his early 20s trying to figure out what Brandon Lee meant to himself. His early career reflected this tension. He appeared in Kung Fu the Movie in 1986, Laser Mission in 1990, Showdown in Little Tokyo in 1991, Rapid Fire in 1992. Each of these was an action film. Each of them used his physical ability and the resonance of his name. None of them was what he was building toward. He was good in them, genuinely, observably good, with the specific physical clarity on screen that his father had possessed and that is not teachable. But they were not the work he intended to do with his career. The Crow was different. The graphic novel by James O. Barr about a rock musician named Eric Draven who is murdered alongside his fiancée the night before their wedding and who is resurrected a year later by a supernatural crow to take revenge on the criminals who killed them, had been in development as a film since the late 1980s, with multiple directors attached and detached. When it came to Brandon in 1992, he recognized immediately what it was. It was a dramatic role, a character who was murdered, who grieved, who loved, who suffered, a character whose physical capability was present in the film, but was not the film's subject. The film's subject was love and loss and what survives. This was not an action film. This was the kind of film he had been trying to make. He accepted the role. He moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, where the production was based at Carolco Studios. Filming began in February 1993. The schedule was demanding, night shoots primarily, to match the visual aesthetic of O. Barr's graphic novel, which had been drawn in high-contrast black and white with heavy shadows. The crew worked through February and into March, building the world of the film around Brandon's performance, which by the accounts of the director, Alex Proyas, and others on set, was exceptional, the best work of his career, a performance that went beyond the requirements of the genre into something more interior and more real. The production had already had a difficult run. On the first day of filming, a carpenter was injured when a crane struck a lighting grid and caused a power surge. A construction worker put a screwdriver through his hand. A driver drove a car through the studio's backlot wall. A sculptor had been burned over much of his upper body by a freak studio accident. By late March, the crew had begun to talk about the production as cursed, the specific folklore that develops around any project with an unusual concentration of bad luck. They were in the final 2 weeks of filming. They were almost done. The scene scheduled for the night of March 31st was the scene in which Eric Draven is murdered. It appears early in the film, the inciting event, the death that precedes the resurrection and the revenge, and it required the character to walk into his apartment and be shot at close range. The gun used in the scene was a real revolver, loaded with blank cartridges, not live ammunition, but cartridges from which the powder charges had been removed, so that the gun would fire and produce the sound and flash of discharge without sending a projectile. What the prop department had also loaded into the gun earlier in the production was a dummy round, a cartridge made from a live round with the powder charge removed, used in close-up shots to make the weapon appear properly loaded when the camera was close enough to see into the cylinder. The dummy round, improperly prepared, the primer had not been removed from the cartridge, had partially discharged in an earlier scene, probably weeks before March 31st. The tip of the bullet, the actual projectile, had separated from its casing under that partial discharge and become lodged in the barrel. Nobody noticed. The gun was not properly inspected after the earlier incident. When it was brought back to the set for the March 31st scene, The bullet tip was still there, sitting in the barrel, invisible to anyone who had not specifically looked for it. When Michael Massey fired the blank cartridge at Brandon from 15 feet away, the explosion of the blank's primer and gunpowder propelled the .44 caliber bullet tip, the projectile that had been sitting in the barrel since an earlier day of filming, out of the gun and into Brandon's abdomen. The groceries Brandon was carrying for the scene scattered from the blank's concussive force, as they were designed to. The scene looked, initially, entirely like it was going correctly. Brandon fell backward, as the character was supposed to fall. The director, Alex Proyas, called cut. Brandon didn't get up. The crew realized something was wrong when they saw the blood. By the time anyone fully understood what had happened, Brandon had been unresponsive for long enough that the damage was severe. He was rushed to Hanover Regional Medical Center. The surgical team worked on him for several hours. They gave him 60 pints of blood, the equivalent of the full blood supply of 5 adult men. It was not enough. He died on April 1, 1993, at 1:04 in the morning. Medical examiner Leon Andrews concluded that Brandon Lee died of a single gunshot wound. The death was ruled accidental. North Carolina District Attorney Jerry Spivey announced on April 27, 1993, that the cause was negligence on the part of the film crew, the failure to properly inspect the weapon, the improper preparation of the dummy rounds, the absence of the basic safety protocols that should have prevented the situation from arising. No criminal charges were ever filed. Michael Massey, who had fired the gun, was not charged. He was the one who pulled the trigger, but the bullet that killed Brandon Lee was in the barrel before he did. Massey carried the experience of it for the rest of his life. He died in 2016, 23 years from the night in Wilmington. Eliza Hutton, Brandon's fiancée, was in Los Angeles when it happened. They had been together since the late 1980s and engaged since 1992. The wedding was scheduled for April 17, 1993, 17 days after the accident, 8 days after Brandon died. They had chosen the venue in Ensenada, Mexico. Eliza had been planning it while Brandon finished the film. She received a phone call on the morning of April 1 telling her Brandon had been injured on set. The word used in that first call was not the word that accurately described what had happened. She flew to Wilmington. By the time she arrived, the situation was clear. Brandon died at 1:04 in the morning. He was 8 days from marrying the woman he had asked to spend his life with. The dress had already been made. The guest list had already been assembled. The venue was already booked. Eliza Hutton has spoken publicly about that period only rarely and in the specific way of someone who has decided carefully which parts of a private grief can be shared and which belong entirely to her. She has never remarried. In 2013, in an interview marking the 20th anniversary of Brandon's death, she described the scale of the love and the scale of what was lost, and she said that the experience had changed the architecture of her life in ways she was still understanding. Brandon Lee was 28 years old. He was 8 days from his wedding. He had been building toward both the film and the life simultaneously, and both were in their final days when the gun fired. Brandon Lee was buried at Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, on Capitol Hill, beside his father. Bruce Lee had been buried there since July 1973. The grave that had stood alone on that hillside for 20 years now had a second stone beside it. Father and son, born in Oakland, died young, buried in Seattle, the city where Bruce had first taught martial arts and built the first version of what would become Jeet Kune Do. The Crow was completed after Brandon's death. The final 2 weeks of filming were shot using a body double and a combination of digital face mapping and compositing that placed Brandon's previously filmed footage into the new scenes. The technology was not seamless. Some of the work is visible to attentive viewers, but it was sufficient for the film to be finished and released. The Crow opened in American theaters on May 13, 1994, 44 days after Brandon Lee died on April 1. It became a cult classic immediately, beloved by audiences who found in the story of Eric Draven, a man who died before his wedding, who came back to avenge what was taken from him, who carried grief as a form of purpose, something that the circumstances of the film's making had made resonant beyond what the story alone could provide. Bruce Lee, Enter the Dragon, died 6 days before it opened, 32 years old. Brandon Lee, The Crow, died 44 days before it opened, 28 years old. The numbers are different. The distance is not. Both men died in the specific window between finishing their work and seeing the world respond to it. Both films became more significant after their makers' deaths than they would have been otherwise. Both men are buried on the same hillside in Seattle, in the specific proximity that the living had never quite made to maintain. Bruce away on location, Brandon growing up in the gap his father had left, and that death made permanent. Brandon Lee grew up in his father's shadow and spent his career trying to establish that he was something other than a shadow. He succeeded. The Crow is genuinely his film, genuinely his performance, genuinely distinct from anything his father made. And then he died 8 days before his wedding in a scene in which his character was shot and killed, from a bullet that had been sitting in a prop gun since an earlier day of filming because nobody had checked. The scene in which Eric Draven dies and the scene in which Brandon Lee died are the same scene. The character came back. Brandon did not. If this story moved you, subscribe and leave a comment. Did you know Brandon Lee died while filming the exact scene in which his character was murdered and that his wedding was 8 days away? Share this video and tell us in the comments, how do you think about Brandon's legacy separately from his father's?